Welcome back to our study in the book of Colossians. We're in chapter 3. Paul's been talking to us about how important it is to do things to the glory of God and to reflect the life of Christ in how we live. And so we're going to step into another section of that chapter where he deals with the family, where he deals with who we are in that close-knit circle of people we're born into, and also that we marry into too. And he specifically addresses that here as we start in verse 18. He says, "Wives, be subject to your husbands, as is fitting in the Lord. And husbands, love your wives, and do not be embittered against them." It's very interesting because he uses the word subjection, or we can also translate that as respect. And then we look at how he tells husbands to love their wives. And this is very interesting because if we go back to Ephesians chapter 5, we see him saying the same thing, only he says, in addition to that, as Christ loved the church and gave his life for the church. So there's an example there. And that's important that we see that, because when we look at this language in the Greek, we aren't just seeing women who are supposed to be subjected to or submitted to or respecting their husbands, and that's their only job. Nor are we seeing husbands as required to love their wives by what they do for them and by how they sacrifice for them. But we see both of these situations in a circular motion. In other words, we love and we respect each other. We love and we are subjected to each other as husband and wife. Why is that? Well, because each has strengths and each has weaknesses. And so when we understand what those are in the specific relationship of husband and wife, then we can love them for who they are, and we can respect them for what they are and what they can do and what they're capable of doing to make that marriage a wholesome relationship in Jesus Christ. So it's a matter of loving, respecting, loving, and subjecting ourselves to each other. I think this is where the popular patriarchal attitude comes into play over the last 19 centuries in the Christian faith, is because we have gotten to the place where we think that men have to be some kind of superhero in the home and everybody's kind of got to grovel at their feet, and that's not the way it should be at all. The husband is required to lead the home spiritually, okay, and that's what some men fail at, very much so. And in certain marriages, the man does enact the spiritual leadership the way he should. But for the most part, we see that there's an equality of how we live together between a husband and a wife because of the strengths and the weaknesses that each have and each can appreciate and each can compensate for. Goes on in verse 20 to say this: "Children, be obedient to your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing to the Lord." Again, we keep this in perspective that this is a Christian home with Christian parents, and these children are being raised as Christians in the home, and so they are to obey their parents, who will not violate God's law in their commands and in their teachings and in their directives for how these children are to live. So Paul very clearly is making an assumption that we can accept as we read the scriptures here. And so children are not to disobey their parents, because in a real sense of the word, if their parents are leading them spiritually correctly, then at that time they would be disobeying God also. Now, there are certain circumstances where even Christian parents teach their children in incorrect ways, and children with discernment can obviously speak to their parents and show them through the word, if they will, where that is incorrect. Ultimately, we obey God rather than men, and that's the important part that we have to come to understand. But if we have good Christian parents who love and are subjected to each other as husbands and wives, and they know God's word and they're willing to do it, they can teach their children in a very godly way, and their children should obey them in all things, as he says. We'll pick up there in our next session.